got to move off of this topic. One more comment. And then we'll move
The
on
only
to our
reason
next
to focus it all on who's to blame is so that we can prevent it from happening again. And it was the attempt to regulate that brought this about, because the Commodity Modernization Act, which was sponsored by Senator Lugar of our state, that's what allowed these banks to get involved in what's called credit default swaps. And so they got paid again after they bought insurance on these loans that they knew would fail.
Essentially
they knew they
betting
would,
against.
so they bet against
Right.
them, and then they got paid again. That's why AIG got bailed out, because they were the ones that offered these credit default swaps to the banks. And if they hadn't gotten bailed out, then Goldman would have never got their, insurance money, if that's what you want to
The
call
real
it.
reason AIG got bailed out is because they paid their insurance. They paid the politicians before they took office, so they
Yes.
they know who the boss is.
Well, they also hold the federal pensions, too.
And I
So
think
they didn't
we'll-
want them to fail.
Well, we may delve into this territory later on in the broadcast. So let's end this issue right there and move on to another one. This is going to be an interesting one. Balancing safety and freedom. And here's what I want to start with. The National Defense Authorization Act, which was just signed by President Obama. It allows it could be construed by some people as allowing the indefinite detention of even U.S. citizens who are suspected of being belligerent without trial. Let me throw this out there. Is this a slippery slope toward tyranny, as some have suggested?
That's something that Occupy has kind of kept an eye on as well here in Fort Wayne. We've done 2 rallies. We've tried to make those educational, stopping people and explaining to them what's going on, because what's interesting is that most people have no idea what we're talking about. The 2 rallies that we held were some of the only times the local media had ever covered the NDAA or the signing of it, despite the provision in there that, in my opinion, does allow for the indefinite detentions of U.S. citizens without trial, without charge, and in
The fact
my
that it's even a
opinion-
matter of opinion is cause for concern.
Yeah,
Right.
well, I've read the section of the legislation. And of course I'm no legal expert, but I can see how it would be construed that way. I'm interested to hear from the Tea Party movement on this as well.
I think this should be the one area where we should have complete agreement. When it comes to issues of finance and size and scope of government, obviously there's going to be areas we're not going to agree on. But what we're seeing right now is a radicalized move to a high-tech, high-surveillance, militarized police state. We have these fusion centers coming into all these different communities. Almost all of our major cities now are getting rings of surveillance cameras that will be capable of doing face recognition, real-time monitoring, tracking. The moment we start.
By the way, I have not fact-checked that particular item, so we're trusting you on it.
I sent it to you. Well, actually, there was a great disinformation article by the Associated Press that was in the various newspapers, and in it they said, it's wonderful, Indianapolis is going to get all of these surveillance cameras for the Super Bowl. And then about 8 or 9 paragraphs down, it finally said, well, actually it isn't because of the Super Bowl. They're not going to be taken out when the Super Bowl is over. In fact, they're going to continue to install almost all of Manhattan, almost all of downtown London is under constant surveillance.
So you think we're becoming a police state? You think the United States is becoming a police state?
We're putting in the apparatuses of a police state. We're certainly not a police state right now. There's lots of freedoms and liberties. What they're doing is they're putting in the apparatuses. The FAA just approved to have a wide expansion in the number of drones. They're projecting 30,000 drones flying around, covering American airspace in just 8 years by 2020. Is this what the American people want? In London, the feeling of the police state is everywhere, and increasingly it's coming here. The question is, where was the discussion? When did we have the conversation? Do we want these sort of changes or not? I don't remember it ever having occurred. They just suddenly show up, there's your cameras,
right,
and here's your new surveillance, and isn't it a wonderful thing? Homeland Security said you need it.
Yeah, by executive fiat, these things come down. Bob, what do you think? Is this a step toward tyranny?
I think it's a major one. I think it's, say I'm a history major, I went to IPFW, graduated here, and so I see a continuation of policy rather than something out of the blue. I think the military-industrial complex has added a bit more capitalist flavor to it, but I think it's in government's interest to stay in power.
Are you worried though? Are you one of those people who's worried that we're on the way toward government watching us in some form or fashion, keeping tabs on us all the time?
I think anyone who's not worried about
there.
that's naive.
Anybody who's not worried about that is what?
Naive.
Naive, really?
Yeah,
Explain.
we're seeing more and more of our freedoms being eroded through the surveillance, through the TSA, through all types of government intervention. And a lot of our local governments and state governments, they're not being asked, about these things taking place. They're being forced to do it. They're being brought into all of this at the behest of the federal government. We're seeing more and more of the executive orders, the laws that are coming down and going through Congress to just tell us that we're going to be losing more and more of our freedoms. People aren't looking into this because they're too busy doing other things, and we're trying to make them aware of what's coming down the pipe, because it eventually is going to affect every one of us, not only the ones that are in this room, but the American public.
Max,
and before you know it, your liberties are going to be flipped right out of your hand.
Max, I know you wanted to say something. You spoke up. About this.
I just think anybody who thinks it's still a matter of question whether or not this government's intruding on the lives of citizens just isn't paying attention. I mean, there were just these two attempts at passing laws to censor the internet, SOPA and the IP Protect Act. Both of them failed, and then they just went ahead and started enforcing them anyway. They're privatizing, commoditizing information in every form, and anything that's not under the control of a big corporation is contraband. So that's why all of a sudden, if you get on YouTube, once in a while, now you try to watch a video, and sometimes the video's been yanked by somebody who claims to own a copyright, and that happens preemptively, without any due process, and it's in the hands of the private corporations, not any enforcement agency of the government at all. And our information is being privatized, our security is being privatized. We've been hearing a lot about Strap for the last few days, and they're basically a privatized security service that's doing the work of the CIA. They're doing covert intelligence on behalf of the government, on behalf of the military, but they're a private organization that has no accountability to the American people.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to hop in. I agree with Max. I think we've had an increasing amount of private firms stepping in to where it was a public entity, where it was in the public interest to have a national defense. But now all of a sudden, I mean, mercenaries are nothing new, but I think the rate in which we are basically funding private firms with a blank check is just bankrupting
You're against
them.
it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask you about the Patriot Act. We're going to get to Sarah for some of your comments in just a second. Who thought the continual reauthorization of the Patriot Act was a good idea? Anybody here? No? Tea Party? No? Okay.
being argumentative.
All right. Now, this is interesting. Let's hold that thought, and we'll get to that in just a second. First, I want to go back to Sarah Jansen and see what people are saying via social media.
Thanks, Mark. The conversation is continuing online. We've got some interesting comments on the topic of big government versus big business. One Twitter follower said big government is not the same as big business, except when big government is staffed with big business people, which is interesting, seeing that both sides kind of disagree on that issue. One question that we've gotten from the audience, wanting to know the thoughts of each side on the fair tax versus other approaches to tax reform. And also, going off that discussion with restriction of freedoms, we had someone in the audience ask the question, will there, with all the laws being passed restricting our freedoms, will there ever be anything done about the lack of equal opportunity at the workforce?
Will there ever be anything done about the lack of equal opportunity in the workforce? Well, maybe we'll have a chance to get to that in a second. I'm not sure exactly what the person is driving at. I don't know that it necessarily has to do with balancing safety and freedom, but we'll tuck that away. Maybe we'll have a chance to get to it. I wanted to talk about the Patriot, which, as you all know, allows for things like roving wiretaps. What would you say to those who say, and this, by the way, is I think what the federal government has been saying, this is necessary in this day and age. Fort Hood and 9/11 have proven that terrorism is a unique animal. It is fierce, it is aggressive, it is agile, and we need to be vigilant like we never have before in watching for it.
This is nothing new. Throughout all of history, governments have had a boogeyman. If you read 1984, it's just perfect. There's always the boogeyman. We have to take all your liberties and freedoms from you because the boogeyman will get you.
Why does the government want to? Okay, let's say that your assertion is true. Why would the government want to take our liberties from us?
It's easier
power.
to do the job of governing if you have total control. I think that's all there is to it. Sorry to interrupt you.
Power, yeah.
Power, and power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolute. And what I've seen in politics is if somebody gets elected as a village clerk, they want to be the treasurer. And if they're the treasurer, they want to be a state rep. And if they're a state rep, they want to be a senator and then congressman and president. It's natural. And when people get political power, when people get power over other people's lives, it's insatiable. It creates a rapacious appetite to have more and more and more. And there's a voyeuristic nature to Homeland Security, or the American Gestapo, some call it, in that they want to know more and more and more and more, and they just can't stop themselves. And how much is enough to know? The TSA took an 85-year-old lady and strip searched her. I mean, she soiled herself on her flight to Michigan. These things that are happening are just, they're absolutely unbelievable. They're sitting there giving these searches to little kids trying to get on airplanes. Like they think that their parents are going to use them as terrorists.
Are we all in agreement on, I'll take myself out of it, but are you six all in agreement on it?
One thing that troubles me is that the very same people who say we need these because of terrorism, we need to know what's going on, then they don't even allow the use of the term terrorism. They don't want to call terrorists terrorists. They don't want to call the terrorist acts. You're banned if you try to use those acts. So what's the purpose here? What's going on here?
I think there
That's
is
what we
an
need to
issue
get
with
to that.
defining what terrorist acts are, and I think that's a lot of where we get in trouble as a nation, is we want to look at terrorism as an act of war, and it just simply is not the case. It's not coming from a foreign government. It's not coming from a foreign military.
You don't think the 9/11 attacks?
It wasn't a military
constituted an
attack.
act of
It was
war?
a crime. It was a murder. It was something.
Not an attack on the homeland.
It was an attack on the homeland, but it wasn't an act of war.
Actually,
it was.
It's a
That's
crime.
different.
Terrorism is a crime. It is
act of
not
war.
an act of war. It does not come from a state or a military.
I would disagree with Max.
Yeah.
I think the terrorists would disagree. I think
Well,
they feel that they're in a war.
I
right.
disagree with Max, not on terrorism as a crime, because it is, but I think it can be perpetrated by states. I think it's perpetrated by states all the time. And, I mean...
Probably more often than we know.
Right, I mean, I think the definition that I'm aware of is the deliberate targeting of civilians. And so...
Yeah, that's governmental terrorism.
and
government's
that's-
perfectly capable of
That's state
terrorism.
acts of terror as well.